Thank you for coming back after a nice lunch. I hope this doesn't prove to be the nap period for everyone. But we're going to follow on to the topic of UN reform in this panel. So it's my great pleasure to introduce these three speakers. I am not going to provide any lengthy introduction of each of them, if only because 1 hour is not sufficient time to give justice to their distinguished accomplishments. But I would like to introduce you to Brett Schaefer from the Heritage Foundation, Thomas Wright from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and Lee Feinstein from the Brookings Institution. And I will say that all these panelists here are prominent experts on multilateralism in general, and specifically have written a lot about UN reform. So it's a perfect segue from Ambassador McMahon's speech. So Ambassador McMahon provided a particularly inspiring vision, I think, for the United Nations in addressing global issues. And we come away with the impression that we can put great faith in the UN. But at the same time, we know that the UN is a beleaguered institution, to say the least, and sort of the favorite target for critics who like to point out its many, many failures. So it leaves us with a question, particularly with the start of a new administration, which has a different attitude about the UN than the prior administration, is what exactly should be the U.S. engagement with the United Nations? And specifically how I'd like to sort of start out the conversation is engage with the topic of UN reform. So if you were to advise a new administration on what should be the #1 issue for UN reform, what would that issue be? Brett, do you want to start?
It's a target-rich environment. Lee and I worked in, it was 2005, I guess, on the USIP task force on United Nations reform. And this was 12 lead people and then a number of others. Lee and I were among the others, working on making recommendations on how to reform the United Nations system. And we had a whole book, about 150 pages or something like that, of recommendations for reform. So there's a lot of places to start off with. But if I was going to narrow it down to one area, it would be on improving transparency, accountability, and oversight in the organization. It's incredibly opaque. And just this past, I mean, you can go through a litany of different scandals, problems, news stories that cover these things in the paper on a fairly regular basis that detail what the problems are. And the UN is uniquely unequipped to handle this. And if you go back to the history of the organization, it didn't even have any type of oversight whatsoever until 1994, when the U.S. demanded that they establish a quasi-inspector general, and the Office of Internal Oversight Services was established. And that body is not a true IG. And what I mean by that is it's not independent. Its budget is determined by the General Assembly, and it's subject to the whims and directives of the member states in a lot of different areas, as far as releasing its report, as far as the decisions of the body to follow through on the recommendations. This failure of oversight led in some parts to a number of different failings, as far as procurement, as far as fraud, as far as corruption, in part to the Oil for Food project, Oil for Food scandal. And in fact, the Oil for Food led to the creation of something called the United Nations Procurement Task Force. This was a more independent, more aggressive financial investigatory unit that was created specifically to look at things like the Oil for Food project, UN procurement contracts, and they did quite well. They examined, I can't remember how many different projects, but something on the order of $620 million worth of UN procurement contracts were examined. 40% of the contracts that they examined were found to be flawed with either fraud, corruption, mismanagement, some type of malpractice. And they did their work over 2 years, or 3 years actually, from 2006 to 2008. And this past December, they were eliminated. They did their job too well. So in the UN, doing your job too well, your reward is that you are eliminated. And in fact, they were so reviled on the part of some member states whose nationals in the organization had been targeted or singled out by the Procurement Task Force individually, Singapore and Russia notably, that there was an effort put afoot to actually prevent them from actually going into the OIOS so that their expertise couldn't be extended and taken advantage of by the OIOS. And that's a really serious problem because there are a number of outstanding investigations that are going on that were dropped by the UN Procurement Task Force that are still out there. And indications are that it could involve, again, another hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts. So we need more oversight, we need more transparency, we need more accountability in the organization because although it's not a $1 trillion bailout or a $1 trillion surplus, it is hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. taxpayer money that is going to the organization, and those taxpayer dollars need to be protected.
Okay, so no easy task for priority number one. Thomas, do you want to put in your?
Yeah, I think it's important to start out with what the great challenge facing the United States and the new ambassador at the UN, and what that single great challenge is. And I think it existed before the financial crisis, but it's become much more severe since then. And it's that there's a greater need now than ever before for international cooperation on a range of issues, particularly on economic issues, but that cooperation will be much more difficult to achieve in a world that's under severe stress as countries go their own way. I mean, we saw after the G20 summit where countries said they wouldn't engage in protectionist measures, and then most of them proceeded to do just that. And so the challenge is, how do you increase the net levels of cooperation on key issues in order to, to get solutions to problems like the, financial crisis or climate change or non-proliferation or peacekeeping or any of these wide range of things. I think where I would disagree a bit with Brett is I think reform on an institutional level is quite important, but I think there is no institutional fix to these problems. You don't get to increase net cooperation by fixing some of those institutional problems that do exist. You get it through a sort of a broader approach of renewing sort of leadership at the UN, of deepening bilateral relations with countries and trying to understand where there is an overlap of interest. And above all, I think in sort of working with what works. I mean, try to investigate what parts of the UN work, then fixate on those and try to maximize the potential outcome, of those avenues. And, if you engage in something that doesn't work, then park it or ignore it and come back to it at a later stage for reform. But the question is, do we want to spend the first, year of the Obama administration trying to have macro reform, either at the UN Security Council level or some other level, that will open up a lot of very divisive, issues that are largely about rulemaking and aren't actually about sort of solving these, problems. So I would say for this sort of moment of, crisis, which could last for the next couple of years, concentrate on the problem-solving side, take notes about what needs sort of fixing, and then when you've built up some success, then come back to those reform issues, at a later stage, and be very sort of serious about that. And I agree, I think, with you a lot on what those sort of problems are, but I don't think it should be the first priority at this stage.
Well, as a follow-up to that question, though, you're talking about facilitating cooperation in an organization with over 190 member states. Where does that kind of conversation about cooperation happen, where it would be most effective?
I think at the most basic level, it happens on a bilateral basis, at the UN. I mean, it happens where, the US-UN will engage with the US embassies in different countries around the world, find out what the countries they're interacting with on a daily basis actually sort of think, and then try to carve out some idea of where there's the greatest overlap, and then build coalitions, off that overlap. And so in the economic arena, clearly that might be with, some sort of understanding with, China, but on other areas, maybe on peacekeeping, is bringing in regional partners around some of these trouble spots. But I would say that, we can't constantly think of this as sort of an institutional, sort of problem where it's about some general principles or, procedures. Like, these are political, problems that require overall sort of diplomatic approach, where it's not just at the UN, but it's integrating sort of diplomatic leadership from across, the spectrum of the U.S. government, including the Defense Department, and the State Department and the embassies.
Hey, Lee, what would be your #1 reform goal for the UN?
Well, first I just want to thank my former Boston colleague, Jim Lindsay, for inviting me here. And I think, Jim, you were also on this famous task force on UN reform that Brett and I also served on. And, you know, the principal finding of that report was, which was co-chaired by Newt Gingrich and George Mitchell, who's the former Senate Majority Leader, is now President Obama's Special Envoy for the Middle East. They served together in the Congress for a substantial period of time, and they, you know, represent different poles in the sort of mainstream political spectrum. And but they nonetheless agreed on the conclusion that an effective UN is strongly in America's interests. And well, that sounds like a very modest thing to say. It was actually quite a significant one, given the range of views on this panel and the two co-chairs. So I think that that's an important starting point and reflects the degree to which there's, you know, I'm not a big fan of the word bipartisan. I would say sort of cross-ideological recognition of the importance of the UN in certain areas for American foreign policy goals and interests and more broadly. On the question of reform, you know, there's reform capital R and there's reform small r. And I would say that the kinds of reforms that Brett were talking about, which are essential for any organization to have credibility and legitimacy on the big issues, I would put those in the small r category, not because they're less important, but because they go to the sort of the management issues. But I think, you know, the first question has to be reform for what? So you can have the most effective internal oversight, accounting process, budgeting process, et cetera, but if you don't have a clear idea of what it is you want the United Nations to do, or to put it slightly differently, if you don't have a clear articulation of how the UN fits into American foreign policy at this moment, then the reform issue really becomes a secondary issue. And so I think that that's the essential unasked question here, and I can you know, filibuster and give you my answer to that, but I'll wait. But just to try to be responsive to your question, you know, I would say you know, one genocide can ruin a Secretary General's day, you know, and so the UN is unfairly blamed for the inaction of its member states in preventing mass atrocities, but that's just the reality. And so Kofi Annan, when he was, before he became Secretary General, he was head of the peacekeeping office, he never was really able to shake the fact that the Rwandan genocide happened while he was in charge of the peacekeeping function. And that was to a certain extent unfair, but also it was the reality that he faced. And Ban Ki-moon faces the same reality with Darfur as well. He inherited this conflict, but the inability to end it is going to be something that, well, the inability so far to end it has really tarnished his authority in the organization, and depending on how this all proceeds, it's going to have a big impact on what happens. So what I would say is the sort of the top priority is, how can the United Nations be a more effective vehicle for you know, preventing and, if necessary, stopping mass atrocities? And there are a range of specific things that one could do. You know, the obvious area here is peacekeeping, where the UN is doing a lot better. You know, some independent reports by places like RAND believe that the UN has actually done a better job in peacekeeping operations than the United States has done in recent years. I think that the methodology of that report is a little bit suspect, but I think that the underlying point is that the UN has done much, much better in peacekeeping, and yet you still have a huge capacity problem. And the main issue, to conclude here, is that the UN is not able to mobilize troops reliably when the Security Council authorizes an operation and says go. And the best example of that is Darfur, where you do not even have half the authorized strength now. What? How long after the resolution? It's a year after the resolution. So this is you know, inexcusable, and it undermines the deterrent effect of peacekeeping operations to the degree that you could say they have a deterrent effect. and it undermines the credibility of the United Nations. It undermines the credibility of the members of the Security Council who vote to authorize these peacekeeping operations. So if there were one problem that I would want to look at, it would be how you could, while maintaining national decision-making and not creating a standing army, which would be something that I would strongly oppose, how you can more rapidly have ready, trained, capable troops available when the Security Council, including the United States, votes for these operations.
Well, all of these are very ambitious goals for the UN and probably not resolvable in the short term. But particularly, believe what you said about peacekeeping raises the question about how you make the UN effective. Two sides of the coin here. One is you need the political will, which is hard enough to muster domestically and internationally. But the second, probably more difficult problem is resourcing it. Sort of pragmatic, down in the dirt, raising the money. In particular, in peacekeeping, we found the U.S. pays for more than 20% of overall UN peacekeeping operations. Now, what happens in a current economy such as this to the goal of enhancing the UN peacekeeping capability? How would you make the case for increasing resources to the UN at a time where everyone's economies are in such bad shape?
Well, this is sort of a broader question. I'll take the first stab at it. First, I would just say that when the United States makes a 25% contribution for peacekeeping operations, that means that 75% of the price is being paid for by others. So in that sense, just on that very narrow point of view, you can make the argument that you're getting bang for the buck. The second thing is that the United States is overstretched. It's just increased its troop commitment to Afghanistan. It is unable, and in some cases it's not really a priority for the United States to undertake these peacekeeping operations, and so it's better that others do it. So that, I think, would be a second argument for the United States to get more deeply involved. And the money that is at issue, in relative terms, even in the relative terms of the modest State Department budget, is small. And so I think I had another really brilliant point that I wanted to make, and I can't now remember what it is, so I'm talking around it. But I do think if the United States goes to New York and votes for a peacekeeping operation, that's serious business. It then has what I would say is a good faith obligation to go to the Congress and get the money. And it has a good faith obligation to go to the Office of Management and Budget, which is the secret place where all the really important decisions are made in Washington, and not play accounting games, and not underfund the peacekeeping account when you know that there are going to be 18-odd peacekeeping operations that are going to cost the United States money. And by the way, this is not taking a pot shot at any particular administration. This is a game that has gone on during the Clinton administration as well as during the most recent administration. In fact, in some respects, in terms of paying dues, the Bush administration has had a better record, but also had the benefit of a Democratic Congress for a big piece of the time. So the answer is that it's actually a good investment. It's leveraging our money, and it's easing the burden on our troops who don't belong in a lot of these places, and even where they did, probably can't be mustered.
Well, that's a pretty good case for increasing U.S. contributions to peacekeeping. But Brett, how would you make the case for increasing U.S. funds to support enhanced monitoring and evaluation in such a complex UN system?
Well, I kind of disagree. I don't think it's a call for increasing U.S. contributions to UN peacekeeping. I don't think Lee said that. Lee's talking about paying in a or anticipating more accurately what the peacekeeping costs are likely to be and preparing for that. The way the U.S. budget works, and we passed a budget in 2008, and for 2009, the UN peacekeeping budget is calculated, in June. And so you're talking about a 9-month lag between when the budget is actually passed and then the peacekeeping budget comes through halfway through the year. And so there's obviously going to be some adjustments and some changes through the course of the year, and the U.S. generally addresses those through a supplemental appropriation or through the subsequent appropriation for the next year. But there's always this lag, this difference. Sometimes it works to the U.S. benefit if a peacekeeping operation is canceled. Sometimes it doesn't. If you have, particularly in recent years when you have these large peacekeeping operations that are adopted in case of Congo or in case of Sudan, or what they're proposing for Somalia, which is another, 27,000 large contribution there. So it's not, and there's another historical oddity here, and that is we skipped our payment to the UN regular budget one year back, I think in 1984, and that leads our payment to the UN regular budget to come through. So we pay our 2008 budget, but we don't pass or authorize that until the end of the budget cycle in September or October 2008. So you have this case where the U.S. is in arrears 9-10 months out of the year and then pays at the end of the year. And so I've actually supported changing that to try and get ahead of the thing. But in the current circumstances, we have a biennial budget of $5.2 billion for the 2010-2011 budget that they're proposing. And granted, it's not $1 trillion, but it's also not chump change either. In getting Congress to double up a payment of over $500 million to $1 billion in 1 year is not something that there's a lot of appetite for, and so it's tough. Now, I'm sorry, what was you wanted me to make the justification for more oversight? Oh, every dollar that we send to the United Nations, it's contributed to the U.S. government and to the United Nations from a taxpayer. The U.S. government has a responsibility to make sure that those taxpayer dollars are not wasted, are used as intended, and used appropriately to advance U.S. interests through the United Nations. And I agree with
Not the case
Lee.
for oversight, the case for paying for oversight.
Oh, well, that's through the UN regular budget, and it's incorporated there. I think we need to boost that up. But eliminating things like the procurement task force, which led to convictions, which led to greater oversight, is actually a net benefit for the United Nations because it ends up getting money back. It ends up making sure that the money is used more efficiently. And that benefits the United Nations. It benefits every organization or every nation that benefits from those expenditures.
Okay. Tom, I want to bring a new question to you, if you don't mind.
Can I say
You want to add up? Okay, sure.
First, because I think Lee raised a very important point about peacekeeping and its future and need for reform in that area of the UN. I think it's important, particularly following on from the last panel, where there was a discussion about counterinsurgency. And it's important to bring up this point, which is that in counterinsurgency, the whole premise of this strategy is based on the fact that war isn't enough. It's part of a political solution and a political strategy in that particular country, and so it brings in all these other facets of power as well as sort of raw military power. I think in peacekeeping operations, one thing that's often forgotten is it should be part of a broader strategy also. It's a means of buying time for a political solution, and too often we use it as a band-aid or as a form of sort of conflict containment rather than as buying space for conflict resolution. And one of the things I would like to see the administration do is to look at it in a sort of a holistic sort of fashion, where every single peacekeeping operation is either part of a broader strategy, it's just one component, or we know that it's a temporary band-aid and we do it anyway for whatever sort of reason. But I think all too often we just sort of see this as a means of sort of fixing a problem in a very temporary way. The other thing that I think a way that U.S. leadership could really be exerted, and I think the Obama administration is well placed to do this, is to put pressure on other countries to pony up more, for sort of logistical support and everything for these operations. I mean, in Sudan is probably the Darfur with the lack of helicopters until very recently, I think, is one of the best examples of that. And I think the administration is in a good position, diplomatically to push for greater contributions from Europe and from elsewhere. Part of being able to do that is, fulfilling one's own obligations, first, and showing you're serious about engagement and leadership. But I think it will be important to push that, and there's some potential to do that in the next few months.
I want to take a slightly different track here. Yesterday in the news, it was announced that the UN formally launched full negotiations to expand the Security Council and to, quote, reflect present-day realities. And we've been hearing a lot about Security Council reform. But sort of the cynical question underlying all of this is, will democratizing the UN Security Council make the UN any more effective? Or more provocatively, and I hate to resurrect this phrase, are we simply putting lipstick on a pig? Or are we rearranging the deck chairs in the Titanic? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll start. I mean, to me, if you want to create a strategy for making the Security Council less effective, less decisive, and less likely to act, I would want to expand the Security Council. I mean, especially if you're adding the veto along with permanent members. The Security Council already is an extremely gridlocked body that is often subject to half measures, the lowest common denominator solutions. And the more parties you add to this discussion in the council, the more votes you have to lobby for, the more concerns and national concerns you have to take into account in the resolution negotiating process, the more likely you are to have gridlock, the more likely you are to have lowest common denominator, even lower common denominator solutions that you have. I mean, you take the Sudan example that Lee had. Sudan is somewhat of a protectorate of China. China made sure that Sudan's concerns were expressed in the resolution authorizing a joint AU-UN peacekeeping force in Darfur. One of those things was Sudan has veto power over what countries are going to contribute to that operation. They've pretty much insisted that most of those are Chinese or African in nature. And so you talk about a lack of capacity. Well, you also have a limitation on the supply there. And particularly when you're talking about skilled peacekeepers, the African nations don't have the resources that other countries do. And so this is a problem as well. And you're more likely to see these types of resolutions, these limited resolutions, if a peacekeeping operation is approved at all, adopted in different cases as countries' own bilateral, multilateral, regional interests are expressed in those resolutions. Mm-hmm. So if I really wanted the Security Council to be effective, and I understand there's a drive for expansion, I would limit the number of expansion extremely low. And I think that the proposal that's on the board, about 26, 27, 25 countries, including 6 permanent members, is going too far, and incredibly too far, because I think it's going to have a detrimental effect on the effectiveness of the Council.
Do you both agree, or do you think that the benefit overall of the enhanced legitimacy from Security Council reform is worth the possible cost of ineffectiveness?
I guess I think it's a distraction because I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, I think there was a good faith effort to make it happen a few years ago. Lots of countries were vetoed basically by other countries. I mean, Italy mobilized to stop Germany from getting it. Argentina mobilized to stop Brazil from getting it. And the same between China and Japan. Because for all of those countries that won't be on it, they stand to lose from the fact that their larger neighbors will be on it, and there's no way around that. So that's quite a big problem. There's the problem that Brett brought up that I agree with, that we really the question here, and I go back to the thing I said initially, is how do you increase the levels of cooperation? Right? If that's what we're trying to do, if we're trying to get a more sort of positive outcome and more sort of coordination, how do we go about doing that? And is expanding the number of members the right way? I think there's a long-term challenge where that needs to happen, because over time, legitimacy will be eroded and will become less effective. But in the near and medium term, is that the best sort of investment of resources, particularly when we've been through an attempt to reform it quite recently, and that didn't come close to succeeding. So I guess my concerns would be, that it could lead to greater gridlock. I think there is a case for reforming and expanding the number of members if you were to dilute the veto for everyone, but that's not going to happen either. I think it's important to remember, though, that the veto was originally a Soviet idea, and the Roosevelt and Truman administrations opposed it. And I think you could make a case that it would serve U.S. interests to get rid of the veto and to have sort of a super-weighted majority vote, because the reality is that the U.S. would always win, those votes, essentially. And there's only a tiny number of sort of political censure resolutions where it could be, difficulty, and you could construct it in a certain way to actually exclude those and just to dilute the veto on immediate action. Because if you look over the last 10, 20 years, it's always the U.S. wanting immediate action. The U.S. is never in the position of saying, don't act or intervene, and all of those issues that come up, where there's a large coalition of countries wanting to act, the U.S. is leading. So I
With
think
the
you could
exception
make...
is Israel.
Well, there isn't a majority in the Security Council for doing that. I mean, the U.S. would win a democratic vote on the Security Council, although that's the largest problem. I acknowledge that's a weakness with the proposal, but I don't think that's going to happen either, right? I just think it's important in a discussion about it to acknowledge that the U.S. is stronger than needing a veto because it has lots of allies around the world and is the best position to lead. The people who want a veto are French leaders, France and Britain and Russia and China. But in any case, the question is, will it happen? And if it did happen, would it make it more effective? I think there are a lot of doubts in both scores. So the question then becomes, how do you bring in those countries who are excluded and feel aggrieved into the process in some other way? And I think there's a way to bring them in through things like the G8 or G8+5, or just through more sort of minilateral and bilateral relationships around the world, that you can actually have them, at the table and try to get some, solution. But we ought not sort of kid ourselves if there's this sort of institutional fix or some grand formula that if we were just to get that formula right, that all of a sudden all our problems would be, solved.
Mm-hmm. In fact, there's a statement by Susan Rice just the other day that the U.S. has not set out a firm position on this particular topic, but it says it will favor expansion in a way that will not diminish the Council's effectiveness or efficiency, trying to have it both ways. Mm-hmm. But there is that fundamental question of whether or not the U.S. can effectively make the case for diluting its power in the Security Council. How do you sell that?
Well, first of all, to describe the Security Council as deadlocked is to describe the goal that the framers of the UN Charter had for the Security Council.
Right.
In other words,
Right.
part of the machinery was intended to prevent major decisions from being made without the assent of the big parties, which I would argue is a good thing. So, we talk about gridlock, we also talk about getting a big power buy-in, which is something that is essential, particularly when it comes to momentous decisions like sending troops into areas. So I just think we need to remember why we have the system we do. You then have to decide what you want from the Security Council. Do you want the Security Council to have more legitimacy or less legitimacy? Or put it differently, do you want the Security Council to continue to have legitimacy? Do you believe that that's in America's interests or not? If you believe that the Security Council ought to continue to have international legitimacy and enhanced legitimacy, and that is my view, because I believe that's in America's interests and in broader interests as well, then you have to update the membership. Now, that is not easy, but that is not impossible either. There have been plans that have been put forward that have been agreed by groups of North and South. I would not give any new countries the veto. There are even interim steps where you could have long consecutive terms, and you could decide who the countries would be that were on there. I think that the most important thing from the American perspective is, without commenting directly on what Susan said, which is Ambassador Rice said, which is exactly the same position as the previous administration's position, the United States needs to be fully behind the idea of Security Council modernization and expansion, and not half-hearted about it. I think that that is an extremely important message for the United States to send if it decides and believes that the Security Council's legitimacy is important. Because after all, it is the position of the United States government, although it's not the position of a lot of other governments, that the Security Council has lawmaking authority internationally. And so if the Security Council decides to do something, it's mandatory on other governments. So if you believe that that's an important tool to have, then you need to have other countries actually accept that, interpretation of events. And I now remembered the aphorism I wanted to use before, because you had talked about political will and capacity, and I guess I wanted to just talk about the relationship between those two things, because I think you were exactly right, which is, everybody says, well, there's an absence of political will. Well, this is certainly true, and when there's a will, there's a way. But the opposite is equally true. When there's a way, there's a will. And if you do not have the capacity to conduct operations or do things, then you dissipate the political will. Because after all, who wants to, climb on board a cause that's hopeless, right? So, who wants to advocate for strong action in Darfur if you can't muster the troops to do it? So I think that these two things are very closely connected, and hopefully what you could do in a whole range of areas, and not just in peacekeeping, is by building up the capacity of the UN to be more effective, efficient, and prompt in its activities. You also stiffen the spine of the members and their political will.
I can add two things to that. I want the maybe it comes as a surprise to somebody out there. The United States has benefited from an effective United Nations, and that's why I express this concern about the Security Council. But at the same time, and Lee's talking about how you have an expanded membership on the Security Council that lends legitimacy, and there's, to some extent, there's an argument for that. I mean, it's a travesty that Japan, as a second largest contributor, is not part of the council. But getting Japan also entails getting all these other countries. And legitimacy comes from participation, but it also comes from effectiveness. And if you have a large council that is, granted, I agree with you that the founders thought that saw value in having a veto from great power participation and buy-in. But if you have a council that's so gridlocked that it can't take effective action, that also undermines the legitimacy of the council and the reputation and status of the council. And second, aside from the fact that getting Japan on there would entail superseding the Chinese veto of that, which is a political issue, or getting India on there will supersede getting Pakistan and the OIC concerns resolved, or getting Brazil will mean getting Argentina and Mexico buying, all these different political problems. But let's say that you do get expanded Security Council. This issue is going to come up again in 20 years, and I defy you to say that this council is going to replace permanent members in the future with other rising powers, and so you have a momentum for further expansion down the road, which leads to more gridlock, is what I'm talking about.
If I may, if I'm not violating rules, I mean, I think that I agree with everything you just said. If you have a bigger and therefore more representative, to use your phrase, democratic Security Council that doesn't do anything, that doesn't enhance its legitimacy, it could have exactly the opposite effect. So I completely agree with that. I think that's a really important point. There are some schemes, and there are people who pay more attention to this kind of stuff than I do, where you could build in a system that would not get you reproduce the problems we have now, where you basically freeze dry the membership. Mm-hmm. So you could have consecutive memberships of 10-year consecutive memberships, and then you'd have to put somebody else in there, or you could continue to have a vote on whether that country has a third term. But basically, I think I do not think that this is beyond the capability of human beings to do if there's a strong commitment to do it. And I guess my cop-out point, but which I still think is important, is the key thing here is what is U.S. policy? And U.S. policy ought to be we're not picking names, we only support it to the degree that it doesn't do one thing or another. It ought to be this institute, that the Security Council is important, and it ought to better reflect the realities of the new century. I think just doing that and participating actively and trying to work through this, even if it takes a long time, which it will certainly do, would be important for the United States.
Well, let me ask another question, though, that I don't think we've raised yet. Given that the UN is largely overstretched and, by and large, underloved, and we're dealing with the problems of tax capacity, do you think that there are any critical issue areas of UN activity that should be pursued through alternative forums, either bilateral or multilateral? And if so, what would those activities be, and where would they be pursued?
Well, I mean, I think, you can have other ways of cooperating, but usually they should feed back into the UN process. So a good example is climate change, right? We know that sort of the UN process, universal process, if it was just that, probably wouldn't lead to, an effective solution, because it would be an unwieldy process. That's why there are these sort of separate unilateral negotiations. There's a large emitters forum that President Bush had started, and then candidate Obama endorsed in his sort of campaign, and sort of a version of that, a more fixed sort of version of that. And so those processes would happen simultaneously with the UN process, and ultimately would sort of reinforce it. You could, another analogy might be during the Cold War for strategic arms reductions. I mean, they took place on sort of a bilateral basis between the Soviet Union and the United States, but ultimately it helped the universal sort of process. I just think we need more, sort of forms for sort of cooperation. And the most obvious one is on the, economic side, and there's everything there from a G2 of just like the US and China and deepening engagement there to a G20, which is actually a G22 because 2 countries showed up that weren't invited to the summit.
Who were they?
One, I think it was Belgium and one other country. But there was more than the 20. The 20 includes the EU, but there was a couple more came on. But I mean, that actually, just to go on a tangent for a second, I mean, the G20 gets part of the difficulty with the whole sort of rules-based who's in and who's out, because the G21 to the G40 are going to be pretty upset that they're not in the G20, right? And so once you open up these sort of basic questions about, who is actually in the room, or revising the rules of membership, like at the UN Security Council, you get into a real sort of snake pit of interest where everyone's sort of fighting with everyone else. And my question is just, is that like the best investment of our time right now? I mean, if these are difficult times and there are a lot of problems, shouldn't we be sort of focused on the problems? I mean, I find it hard to imagine, other than sort of long term, how would that, I mean, I definitely think it would be more legitimate and effective in the long term, but would it be more effective in the medium sort of term? So I think, economics, the economic crisis, climate change, possibly non-proliferation, although that may best be handled at a universal level. They're all areas where you have these separate processes.
Lee, what about peacekeeping? Do you think it should be farmed out to regional organizations, for example?
Well, look, I'm all for the idea of competition. The director of the Strauss Center has his own ideas about alliances of democracies, which for a concert of democracies, which I think at one point or another, in an incautious moment, I aligned myself with. And so, I think competition is good. If you have competing institutions, that's fine. I think that, so I think that that's good. And I think in terms of the peacekeeping, I mean, you already have a good set of arrangements where, you've got blue helmeted operations, UN-run operations where UN peacekeepers do stuff. You have others where you have a lead nation that operates, that's blessed by the UN, and then there's sometimes a handoff to blue helmets. And then you have hybrid operations, or nominally hybrid operations, like you're supposed to have in Darfur. There needs to be a lot of work on the regional level, particularly in the African Union. It is really painful, and it's hard to be very optimistic, frankly, about the ability to build up these capacities. But it is almost always better if you can do these things at the regional level.
And Brett?
I agree with that almost entirely. When you have regional actors directly involved in trying to resolve the situation, they have a vested interest in trying to make sure it's resolved for good. The UN presence, while it may be the easiest first option, is not necessarily the best option for resolving them. You can take a case in point in Congo right now. UN's had the largest peacekeeping operation, and currently right there, and it's been there for years. And you had ongoing instability, ongoing problems in eastern Congo, and just recently, the rebel leader Nkunda, General Nkunda, was creating such a problem that it led Rwanda and Congo to join forces to try and resolve that situation. And Congo actually let Rwandan forces come in to try and quell it. And so this is actually a huge breakthrough, considering that Rwanda invaded and helped overthrow the previous government, and then it's been an ongoing very, very tense relationship. But it was spurred on by mutual interest, and that's really the key factor here. But the capabilities of the regional groups have to be enhanced. But I think that we have to be very careful about the UN going into these more aggressive situations, because that's not where the UN's expertise lies. UN is not a war-fighting institution, and we have to, and that's not where we should be expecting it to focus its activities. Where we should be focusing UN peacekeeping activities are in situations more like Liberia, where you have both, multiple sides there, but sides to the conflict that all want to come to the peacekeeping or the peace table. They're so exhausted by the war, they want to find a path forward. And at that point, the UN is simply providing a helpful means for them to achieve a goal that they have all agreed to do, rather than trying to impose a peace on a very unstable situation, which is, I mean, the RAND study made this point, and so did the peacekeeping study, the Brahimi report. And this is a very fundamental thing, and we have to resist the temptation to send the UN into situations of conflict just because there's no appetite on the part of the United States or the EU or somebody else not to do it.
Peace building. Okay, let's open it up for questions at this point.
Josh Busby, LBJ School. This is a question for Lee. You mentioned that it's important for the UN to have a much stronger role of preventing and stopping mass atrocities. And there's a looming decision by the International Criminal Court to issue an arrest warrant for President al-Bashir of Sudan. And I'm wondering, for the government's actions taken in Darfur, there's some concerns this could trigger wider conflict in the region. I'm wondering what your take on whether or not this would be a helpful or problematic move on the part of the ICC.
Yeah, I think it's, look, the ICC was put there to deal with precisely these kinds of issues. So if the ICC was unable to take action to deal with a past genocide in Sudan and ongoing mass atrocities and the possibility of a second wave of genocide, then you have to really wonder what the ICC is there for. So I think, the ICC prosecutor had to take action. This is exactly the circumstance in which the ICC exists. Now, in the whole sort of peace versus justice argument that you're alluding to, the Darfur conflict started in 2003. Bashir has been very canny in doing everything possible to prevent negotiations from those negotiations that concluded from being implemented, in delaying Security Council resolutions from being approved, and then once approved, in preventing those Security Council resolutions from being fully implemented. So the idea that somehow or other the indictment of Bashir is going to slow down the negotiations toward a resolution of the conflict, I think, does not pass the red face test. Bashir has demonstrated over a course of many years now that he has no interest in a negotiated outcome, or only has interest in a negotiated outcome that would be unacceptable to everybody except for him. That's not to say that it doesn't create problems, that it is not without risks, but there are, higher values. One of the higher values is that people who commit mass atrocities, including those who are responsible for genocide, ought to be held accountable for their crimes. And that, to me, in the big picture, will, in general, lead to greater stability in most situations, and you know, there is the possibility of delaying the prosecution for a year, and you can do it indefinitely under one of the provisions of the Rome statute, the ICC statute. I happen to think that that's a bad idea, but I think that the way Sarkozy, when he, the French president has gone about this is not unhelpful. And what he has said is, if the president of Sudan is prepared to reach a comprehensive agreement to end the conflict, and it is in that context that he would be prepared to consider an Article 16 deferral. That is actual real leverage. That's something that Bashir will take seriously. So I don't mean to discount the risks involved. There are risks involved. When you make decisions, you know, nothing is risk-free. But I think in this circumstance, after 6 years of fruitless negotiations and lots of evidence indicating that Bashir was directly involved in some of these genocidal acts, that the prosecutor took the right decision.
Yeah, I agree with almost all of what Lee said, but we just add a couple of things. I mean, I think it's clear that al-Bashir, you know, deserves to be indicted. I think on the merits. Certainly, there's a good case to be made that the ICC prosecutor was correct. But I think a couple of things were, you know, disturbing about the indictment nonetheless. The first was that in the statement or in comments around the time of the indictment, the prosecutor specifically cited the gridlock and refusal of the UN Security Council sort of to do anything. So he sort of hoped that this would kickstart the UN Security Council into action. I think that's sort of that's an indictment of sort of the U.S. leadership at the time and of other members of the Security Council. Not the U.S. was trying to push the ball down the road, but why was it unable to persuade these other countries to go along, and then why were they opposed, right? And so there's a large question about the inability to actually get policy through at the UN Security Council in recent years, although there's been some successes. But the second thing that was disturbing was that never had al-Bashir more support than he did in the couple of months after the indictment. You know, lots and lots of countries came out against the indictment, including, you know, African Union, the Arab League, China, I think Russia. And so I found that sort of, you know, disturbing on the international justice side. There's this indictment, and then all of a sudden, someone who has basically very few or no friends ends up with lots of friends. And we need to ask ourselves why did that, you know, happen? Was that a strategic miscalculation in some way, and what implications does that have for future sort of ICC prosecutions? And the final point I'll make on the final thing I found a little disturbing was on the peacekeeping operations side, because when you talk to the PKO people in the UN or, you know, in the field, they were privately really concerned by this indictment, right? Out of no love for al-Bashir at all. They worried that peacekeeping troops will be targeted in the future because they would be seen as sort of the arresting party of war criminals, that war criminals or potential war criminals wouldn't want to let them in, that there was lots of things that, it isn't that it's not a price worth paying, it's that it wasn't necessarily thought through. They certainly weren't sort of consulted. They didn't feel as if, as if it was part of an overall sort of plan. And so, you know, I think looking ahead, it's important to have some strategic idea about how all of this hangs together, and rather than saying, you know, was the ICC correct in this case, like what's the overall picture and how can we advance those goals? And hopefully it will include an indictment of Bashir and others like it. But I think it has to be done in a way that the outcome works rather than just the process at the beginning works.
We have a question in the back.
I'm C.P. Smith from the LBJ School. Essentially, given the proliferation within the last decade, 2 decades, of all the G organizations, including other international or transnational organizations that some have a regional flavor, others that have a much broader mandate or interest across the globe. Aren't these proliferation of these international organizations actually an indictment of the structure of the UN, in terms that they're an acknowledgement that nations are tired of the gridlock that has been mentioned, and as a result, they're just going to bypass the whole structure entirely and create these new organizations, essentially taking away those same responsibilities and capacities outside of the peacekeeping operations, the military operations, if you will, but replacing those essentially with functional organizations that make the same deliberative, same decision-making processes?
Well, I think it is a reflection of the inability of the UN to address these things head-on. I mean, obviously, if the UN were an effective forum for dealing with these problems, it would be handled through the UN. It's an existing structure. It has a support staff. It has a lot of advantages that the more ad hoc arrangements don't have. The ad hoc arrangements are flexible. They have flexible membership. They can be called. They can be convened. They can be dissolved. There's a lot of advantages to them as well, and I think it is a reflection of some of the limitations of the UN system in dealing with these problems. There's also something to be said for the UN is a universal forum, has 192 member states. Sometimes having all those states around the table is useful and advantageous. Sometimes it's not. And so sometimes, I mean, in part, maybe it's not so much an indictment of the UN being an unsuitable body for it. It's just sometimes it's not useful to have every country around the table and instead have a more focused group.
Either of you want to take a shot at this?
Yeah, I'll just say, one thing. I think it's, I think you made the point earlier, competition can be good between, these organizations, and we shouldn't think that the UN can do everything, right? It can't. I mean, the UN is, firstly, a collection of its member states, and secondly, it has, institutional reasons why it's not the most sort of dynamic organization in the world. Part of that is by, design. So it's not a one-stop shop, and I think one of the things that worries people who favor multilateral solutions is sometimes we think of multilateralism in terms of the UN only, rather than the UN being just one multilateral organization, and that there are others and other sort of options, that can be gone to. I think on the whole question of, because there's a question mark about whether or not the G8 is going to exist in a few months, whether or not it's going to be permanently expanded into a G20 or G something else. I think, we need to stop thinking about these organizations as just reflecting, sort of 80% of the world's population power and economic strength, or whatever the sort of formula is, because sometimes that leads us to say we need an African country, any African country will do, we need a Muslim country, a Muslim country will do. So you see people interchanging Nigeria with South Africa and Egypt, or Turkey and Indonesia, and saying we need some member states that will reflect the world as it is. But these organizations are meant to fix problems, right? So the question is really what countries are integral to the solving of those problems, and they are different. They're not billiard balls that can be interchanged because of their identity. So what we need to figure out is who do we need around the table to get a solution, on climate change or whatever. And part of that has to do with who a country is, but part of it has to do with their, policies. The final thing I'll say is, the G7, G8 gets a bad rap, but if you look back to the origins of that organization in the 1970s, what you actually find is that it imposed sanctions on other countries. It threatened sanctions against one of its own member states, Italy, when it was about to bring communists into the government in the late 1970s. It started out by imposing sanctions on India for the nuclear test in 1974. It imposed sanctions on South Africa. It imposed sanctions on a wide range of other countries in the 1980s. And, if I was sitting in the State Department...
And 90s.
And 90s. And so if I was, sitting in the State Department or something and thinking about these geo-organizations, I'd probably be thinking about, might we be able to resurrect that in terms of Iran if there was a need for, some sort of sanctions, or something else in the future? Like, shouldn't we have a G8 plus a G20? Don't replace what we've got that is relatively effective with something else that we don't know if it's effective or not. Have both. Have a proliferation of organizations and see which works. And there's a certain time investment in that that's costly. But I think that's outweighed by the advantage of actually having it as an option.
We are just about out of time. Are there any further questions? If you could have maybe in 10 words or less to revisit the theme of the conference, what would you suggest that universities should be doing to perhaps inform the debate about UN reform, or to help the UN become more effective as an institution?
I think that the 10 minutes or less. 10 words or less. Where universities have value added is being able to take a lot of time to take a look at very in-depth and complex situations. When you take a look at the UN, This is going to be much more longer than 10 words, I'm sorry. Everything passed by the General Assembly, ECOSOC, Security Council that has an outcome is called a mandate in the UN system. You have over 9,000 different mandates in the UN mandate registry. There was a call from Kofi Annan a couple years ago to review all the mandates. And there was a commission co-chaired by a couple of ambassadors doing a mandate review, and they had a report this past August, and they examined all the African development mandates, 52 mandates, and they concluded that only 18 or 35% of them were current and relevant. They had another one which was the humanitarian cluster, which was 270 some odd mandates, and they found that only 55% of them were current or mandate. I mean, some of these mandates date back to the 1940s. There are still existing ongoing mandates calling on someone to issue a report talking about transferring facilities and authorities from the League of Nations to the United Nations. Somebody does this.
So why not academics?
And so, yeah, no, I'm just saying, but under the UN rubric, every mandate is co-equal. It's passed by the General Assembly, therefore it is just as important as any other thing, including a peacekeeping operation or anything else. So if you proceed under the impression that everything is equally important, what does that cost in terms of effectiveness of the organization truly addressing important things? And so, I mean, the university could look at those different mandates and look at the cost benefit of pursuing all of these things instead of some of these things.
Okay, well, we may usually have the luxury of time, but we don't at this moment. So do you want 50 words or less? Can you do it?
Yeah, I think, I think I view it in terms of the economic, the international financial process, which I think will have two effects. The first is that it's going to create a new range of problems that are going to be really intractable and difficult and need attention. And the second is it's going to put a lot of think tanks out of business because the money, for sort of, private sector sort of study are going to be reduced, right? Foundations, their endowments are way down, universities' endowments are way down too, but, there's going to be possibly a narrowing of the field. And I think it's really important that universities, which are going to remain sort of in place, fulfill that vacuum, that if a vacuum is created, and cut some of the brain power into thinking through some of these things. Because unfortunately, newspapers and magazines and think tanks still exist, but I think they'll be smaller. If this thing continues, they'll be much smaller in number in about 4 or 5 years' time. And it's going to increase the importance of universities. And the question is whether or not universities step up to the plate and fill that vacuum, or they sort of avoid policy. And the LBJ School is a great sort of example of an institute that's very engaged in that policy, and I hope other universities follow suit.
Well, I would say, to get in the little point that I want to get at the very beginning, and to connect it to what you're driving at. Public policy schools can do two things. One is sort of help identify what a strategy ought to be, and two, then help identify what specific policies ought to be. And those are two different things. I would say with respect to the UN, my own little strategy is that the United States ought to treat the UN kind of like a medium-sized country, like France. And that your goal with a medium-sized country is to have good relations with it and to cooperate with it when you can. And in a UN context, that would mean that the UN would be effective in areas where there are overlapping interests, as effective as possible. And then the other reason you have good relations with it is so that when you have inevitable or unavoidable disagreements, that the consequences and costs of those disagreements are not so consequential. So that's the kind of thing, just a simple sort of strategy helps policymakers who don't have time to think in those terms have a big approach to a problem. And they say, oh, okay, I get that. And then they can figure out how to implement it. The second thing I would say, and I've seen advocacy organizations do this with some great effect on human rights issues, is to just come up with, Human Rights First, for example, has done a series of blueprints on issues related to refugees, Guantanamo, torture more broadly. And they're very specific. This is what the administration ought to do in its first 60 days. This is what the administration ought to do first 100 days. This is what it ought to do in its first 6 months. This is what it ought to do in the first year. And just kind of map it out. And it is remarkable it is truly remarkable. Actually, if you look at what Human Rights First did, and you look at the executive orders that the Obama administration put out, you sort of see there's, they're not identical. There are a lot of differences, but there's also some, and there are other organizations that did work like that as well. And that is really hugely, hugely valuable to people inside the government because they don't have time to do that. So if they have a document that's a reference point, even if they're going to disagree with 90% of what's in it, it's a good starting off point, and it's a good way for them to organize. And so the degree to which academics can do that in policy academics, because that's what you all are, that is a major contribution. And I think Thomas's point is essential, which is that the world that I have come from, and Jim Lindsay as well before arriving here, is going to contract. Because that's the think tank world, because the money is not going to be there. And hopefully that will not be the case for places like this, particularly publicly funded ones. And so, so there's a real opportunity to have a role.
Perfect. Well, now that we have our marching orders, I want to thank you very much for your questions, and you can take a break. Thanks.